Wow. Well, you can probably hear I'm in the countryside, and it's lovely to be here. It feels like spring, and that is a good time to be reading the book of Jeremiah. It is the longest book in the Bible, and I'm not going to ask for a straw poll of who has read the book of Jeremiah. I know that I've read it 3 times before studying it for this series, because I've read the Bible from cover to cover 3 times in my life. But frankly, it was all a bit of a blur, and studying it has come as a bit of a shock, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for fun. Today is going to be an introduction to the book. Lots of fantastic people from within our community and a few visitors are going to be sharing passages from this book. But like anyone in recovery from trauma, the book is a bit of a mess. And therefore, today I want to give a little bit of sort of framing to things, because we'll be looking at individual passages over the next few months, and I want to just give a little bit of context to that. Fortunately, the introduction to Jeremiah is a great introduction. So I'm going to ask Fiona if she'll read the first 10 verses of the book of the prophet Jeremiah.
Yes, so this is Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1 to 10, and it's from the NIV version. The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, one of the priests at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah, and through the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, down to the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. The word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. I am too young. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth and said to me, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. There's so much in that passage, so much. I'm going to share my screen now and try and tell you a little bit about the book of Jeremiah. Apologies for the terrible pun, but this is really what the book of Jeremiah is about, and why we as a congregation have chosen it. For those that didn't notice, I gave folk the opportunity to choose one of 4 passages of scripture for us to study, and this one was chosen by the most. And the reason I think it was chosen was because I said Jeremiah, as well as being a book of prophecy about coming disaster, is also a book of prophecy about restoration from disaster. But we can't deal with the future until we're ready to deal with our grief and our loss. So that is where we start and where the book of Jeremiah starts. I want to just tell you a slightly amusing story, or maybe even an awkward story. This is a picture of, you probably all know that I'm into board games. This is a game called Wavelength, where you're given, if you see at the bottom, a couple of phrases, and you have to come up with something that helps people to guess where that purple line is. So if what film is just ever so slightly more of an adventure movie than an action movie? What even do those terms mean? You might say maybe something like an Indiana Jones movie. There's a lot of action, but there's a lot of adventure. And it's a great game to get people talking about, the world and how you see things. We were playing this game with my kids and a friend, and the friend joined us. It must be slightly weird knowing that your friend's dad is a vicar, and the card that they pulled out of the pile was the range of proof of the existence of God at one end and proof for the non-existence of God at the other end. And I mean, it really came out of nowhere. This poor person sitting across the table from me having to choose something that was quite a good proof of the existence of God. And they chose the concept of karma. When I Googled royalty-free images for karma, I got this, which is a crime on so many levels. For a start, they spelt Shiva wrong, and that's an image of Buddha in the background, which is from Buddhism, not Hinduism. And honestly, people who create their own drama deserve their own karma is such a Kardashian kind of thing to say. I have a feeling that Shiva probably didn't say it, especially unlikely to say something that rhymed in English. But we have a really strong idea that karma is how things should be. What we really want in life is for the baddies to be properly punished and for the good people to be rewarded. And in the Old Testament in particular, where there is no second chance, there is no life after death, one of the great problems is when good people have terrible things happen to them, and when bad people have good things happen to them. And in that sense, there's something really deep within us, a deep sense of justice, that when bad things happen to good people, we see that as an evidence that God doesn't exist. Of course, the gospel itself is evidence that we don't get what we deserve. But it's still something very deep inside us. And the story of Jeremiah is how a whole nation copes with the feeling that God has let them down, that things have not happened the way that they're supposed to. We're supposed to be God's people. A king from David's line is supposed to sit in Jerusalem forever. And yet here we are in exile. How on earth did this happen? And we know that the book of Jeremiah began to be collected while the Jews were in exile in Babylon. They're trying to work out what on earth is going on. And here is this, if you like, minority report. Jeremiah was the prophet that said, no, God isn't going to save you. No, it is all going to be terrible. Your hope that everything is going to be all right is misplaced. And now the Jews are trying to work out what on earth has happened. So this is a book about trauma, about dealing with trauma, about finding a way through trauma. And for that reason, the structure of Jeremiah is, well, frankly, it's ridiculous. There is no structure. If someone had collected the prophecies of Jeremiah, the story of Jeremiah, hacked off a bit from the end of other bits of the Bible, put them all in a pile, and then knocked the pile on the floor and forgotten what order they were in, that would be an adequate representation of the book of Jeremiah. Things don't happen in the right order. There's not a sense of, oh, it was bad and then it was good. You know, good things happen, then bad things happen, then good things happen, then bad things happen. there is no clear direction. It is, as I said already, a very good representation of what life feels like when you have experienced trauma. 1 minute is okay, the next minute is terrible, and there is no clear progression. The problem with the traditional stages of grief is that they give you the impression that you just go from 1 to 5 in a straight line, whereas in fact you do a dance from 1 to 2 to 3 and then back to 1 and then to 4 and 2. And Jeremiah feels like that. It feels like a whole nation grieving. As I say, Jeremiah is a book about coping with trauma, with what you might even call a disaster, a national disaster, the end of an entire country. Now, this is something that is perhaps beyond the kind of experiences of heartbreak and sadness and grief that we experience on a daily basis. And one way of understanding trauma and disaster is the way that it malforms and misshapes us going forward. One of my favorite phrases is from a song, which is, "A heart that hurts is a heart that works." It's something that I tell myself all the time, that when we feel pain and sadness, for many of us in this stage of life, say over the loss of a parent, that is a natural thing. It's, in many ways, it's a good thing. It's a sign of love. But trauma goes beyond that and actually breaks us and misshapes us, and we move forward in a disabled way. The book of Jeremiah is really operating on a national level, but as I'll say in a moment, the main metaphor for that brokenness and violence is at a domestic level. But let's just think about the last 20 years, things that have happened. Last night I was watching a film called Official Secrets about the Second Iraq War, which we now know was illegal. That's ultimately brought down a government, caused massive decrease in trust in politicians. We had a financial collapse, which resulted in what was called austerity, but was essentially a decision to shut down public services or minimize them as much as politically possible. We had riots just 10 years ago. We had Brexit, which wherever you stand on it, showed up an incredible divide in the country between those who saw nationalism as the best way to view the world and those who saw globalism as the best way to see the world. The same year, the same kind of divisions struck America. We had the experience of the Me Too movement, which really brought to the surface many issues that had been suppressed around gender-based violence. More recently, the Black Lives Matter movement highlighted the fact that we still have a long way to go in terms of the kind of society we want to live in, if we want to live in a diverse and equitable society. It still raises the issue that many of us in this country hanker for another age in which Britain was a country for white people. And now we're living in one of the strangest national traumas that we've ever had, a crisis in which we cannot even turn to each other. The best thing that we can do, the thing that experts and government alike are asking to do is to live on our own, separate from each other, which feels like something that hasn't happened for a long time, where if we were to reach out to neighbors, we would be pilloried for it. So this is a very, very strange time living under the virus. But the book of Jeremiah is primarily looking back through the exile to a time when Jeremiah was prophesying what was going to happen, and trying to avert that disaster. So we are still in a time where someone who was perhaps as young as Jeremiah was when Jeremiah began to prophesy is trying to speak to the whole world about an impending disaster, when there is a struggle between the sense that if we as a people can change direction, then perhaps disaster can be averted, and yet at the same time a sense of inevitability and an anxiety that in fact, despite the warnings that we're given, we may not be able to change direction. This sense of living in a climate crisis is something that we're going to return to, because for the sake of our species and our planet, we have to live differently to the Jews that listened to Jeremiah. As we'll see over the months, they decided that optimism was the best course, that God would never let such a terrible thing happen, and yet it did. So while Jeremiah works at the level of national trauma, we also have to consider the fact that each of us may or may not have experienced significant traumatic events in our lives. The language that we have now of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the language of triggering, which I've already used, is quite new to us. And I'm someone that grew up in a household in which alcohol was a very significant negative influence, in which there was some domestic violence, in which there was infidelity, and all of those things affect me to this day in an exaggerated way. I never ever like being around drunk people. It re-traumatizes me even after all this time. And for all of us, we are dealing with those kind of scars. What I find the hardest thing about Jeremiah, and I say this only in passing, it will undoubtedly come up over the coming months, is that the God of Jeremiah on occasion comes across as an abusive husband. That the violence that Israel experiences is because she has been unfaithful, and therefore she is worthy of violence. She is worthy of rape. She is worthy of death. Now, I raise this now because I honestly find it incredibly problematic. I find it such a hard read. And we have to face that, and we have to say, either God is like that, in which case the Bible is a story of God learning that violence doesn't work, of God learning to love without violent jealousy. Or we have to say that Jeremiah reflects more the experience of a victim of trauma, trying to make sense of it. And describing God in ways that aren't completely true. The song that we've just sung, that chorus, "You're a good, good father," that's who you are, and "I'm loved by you," that's who I am. That is a mantra of mine. I have half a dozen prayer mantras, things that I just say over and over again. And that chorus is one of mine. That's ultimately what I believe about God. The God of Jeremiah, on occasion, does not sound like that person. If that's something that you want to discuss with me, then I'd be really happy to do that. I can't address that issue, but I would love to sit, ideally, I'd love to sit in a pub with a bunch of people looking at these texts and saying, how do we handle the violence of these texts? Let me just try and give you a little bit of historical context. We all know about Saul and David if we've ever studied the history of Israel, and we probably know about Solomon. Solomon had a great PR team because we all immediately think of Solomon as this wise person, but by the end of his reign, his family was a complete mess, and his children broke up Israel into two kingdoms. The kingdom of Judah in the south, with the capital of Jerusalem, and the 10 tribes in the north, in what was still called Israel. It was a complete mess. And over the next centuries, things didn't really get any better. A couple of centuries after the two kingdoms were created, Israel was completely and utterly destroyed. And the name of Israel wasn't used again until the creation of the modern state of Israel. And then about 150 years later, over 2 years, Judah was invaded 3 times, and ultimately Jerusalem, the capital, was besieged. And we don't know exactly who was taken into exile. For sure, we know that several thousand people at the top of the tree, all the royals, the civil servants, the army leaders, everyone that ran the nation of Judah was taken into exile. We know, especially from the book of Jeremiah, that lots of people were left behind and had to work out how to live with an occupying force, which is a recurring theme in the Old Testament. If you're into your genealogy, that's all of the kings. You've got Saul in the top right, and that square in the bottom right is where we are, the last king. So Josiah, and then it's a revolving wheel of kings at the end, some of them just for a few months. Josiah became king when he was 8. It was a dirty, bloody business being a king in those days. People didn't last very long. So the years that Jeremiah prophesied was those 5 kings in the bottom right, the last kings of Judah. He is there trying to get these young, inexperienced leaders to understand that the end is coming unless they change track. Amazingly, Jeremiah also includes bits nicked from other parts of the Bible. If you want to see this story in the book of Kings, it's the last 4 chapters of the second book of the Kings. It's literally the end of the kingdom. So if you want to read those, that will give you the historian's view of what happened. And bits of those passages have been edited and stuck into the book of Jeremiah, essentially right at the end, to kind of go, look what happened, Jeremiah was right. But that might be an easier read than reading the whole of Jeremiah if you want to get a little bit of a framing of what's happening. I've just got a few minutes before we stop, and I want to I don't normally do PowerPoints with bullet points, but because I've raised the issue of trauma, I want to talk about this way of looking at the book of Jeremiah. What happens when people experience trauma? Well, if you've ever had a car crash, which I had when I was a teenager. I was an absolute classic 18-year-old driver, thought I was immortal, didn't really pay very much attention, and had quite a serious crash. On one level, I can remember that moment really, really clearly, but on another level, I don't understand what I was doing, how I was behaving in the moment of the crisis. Today, we would use the word dissociation. So when a crisis is happening, sometimes people say, well, it was like I was watching myself. People disconnect from what's happening. And we know that for some people, the experience is so traumatic that actually becomes a psychiatric condition. We know that describing what's happened becomes really, really difficult. And one way of understanding the book of Jeremiah is several decades later, it's an attempt to describe what happened. We know that if even there was a shooting in America just a couple of days ago, the first thing that everybody wants to do, even more than describe what happened, is understand why it happened. There's a very, very basic instinct for us to understand why something has happened. Sometimes we feel disconnected from our emotions. So even though we know we should be grieving, our defense mechanisms prevent us from doing that. And really major traumatic experiences can often overwhelm our belief systems, whatever those belief systems are. We have a fundamental faith in the world which is overturned. And yes, we can be re-triggered very easily by traumatic events. So certain things which seem innocuous to other people can create a very powerful emotional reaction in us. So what do people need? The first thing is very, very obvious, but right now it may be that we know someone, or there's even someone in this room with us right now who is experiencing a dangerous, traumatizing situation. The first thing is that people need physical safety. Jeremiah is written from a place of physical safety, so it doesn't deal with that. But if you are dealing with someone experiencing trauma, getting them out of that dangerous situation is the first thing. There's no point in talking about how they're feeling or how they should behave. The first thing is that the person needs to get out of the dangerous situation. Although the Jews are in exile in Babylon, they're actually doing okay. They're not in imminent danger of death or harm. They are serving the empire. People need a way of talking about what happened that doesn't re-traumatize them. People need an explanation that moves towards honesty. I've been in Christian meetings where someone who has recently been bereaved copes with their bereavement by saying that God chose their loved person to live with them in heaven. I don't think that is an adequate explanation for why some people die at the wrong time. But I've learned over time that person doesn't want a theological debate with me in the middle of their grief. The first explanation that we cling to may not be the true explanation, but we may cling to it nonetheless for a time until we're able to cope with the truth. And the hard thing about the book of Jeremiah is that not only is God often pictured as an abuser, but Israel is depicted as saying, I deserve it. I'm the bad person. I deserve to be beaten. I deserve to be raped. I deserve to be killed. That's not an adequate explanation for me in a traumatic situation. So what people need is to move towards a more honest description of what is really happening, but that takes time. And in time, people need to grieve, to cry, to shout. But again, that is something that comes in the right time. And then ultimately, people need to rebuild their faith. It is a hard thing to do when faith is shaken. It's something that we should confront in time. But I just want to reiterate on this page again that if you're dealing with a genuine traumatic situation right now, you have to start with number one before you can even begin to approach any of the other things. We've got 1 minute, and I haven't really talked about the passage, which is a beautiful, beautiful passage. It's a wonderful passage about the prophetic calling, about God's calling to each of us. Jeremiah was very young when God set him apart for this completely thankless task. If you take nothing else away from this talk, take away that image of Greta Thunberg, who started her school strike on her own, because that is the best image that we have for Jeremiah, a prophet wandering around Judah, speaking to commoners and royals, saying, things are not okay, disaster is coming, you need to change course. But God promises not only to uproot, not only to destroy, but to build and to plant. And in the heart of Jeremiah, that's the strange thing, in the middle of the book of Jeremiah is this incredible promise that the future is going to be better than the past, that there is going to be a new covenant that God is going to make with Israel, one that's no longer dependent on religion, but one that is dependent on an intimate relationship with God. The law of God will be written on our hearts, no longer on parchments. And that seed of hope is planted in the middle of all of this chaos. So over the next few weeks, we're going to deal with some of this trauma. We're going to deal with God's anger and destructive violence, but we're also going to deal with God's incredible promise for the future. As we genuinely don't know our future, we genuinely don't know where our home will be, we know that God promises us a new future, and if you like, a new covenant, a new promise. I've only got 30 seconds, and I just want to say, if there is anything in what I've said that you want to address, or you know that you need to address, please contact me or the pastoral support team. We do want to support you. It's really, really hard in these times. So please connect to us as you can. But bless you. Thank you for listening to this really long lecture.